Close your eyes. Imagine a desert that stretches farther than the eye can see, where the wind carries whispers instead of sound, and shadows move with secrets of their own. Northern Mexico at night is vast, empty, and alive in ways most people cannot perceive. Somewhere among the dunes a man walks, not loudly, not recklessly, but like a ghost. His name is Heriberto Lazcano, known simply as El Lazca. He commands power not with guns or shouts, but with patience, silence, and the careful orchestration of fear and loyalty. Tonight, you will follow him through the shadows of settlements, the corridors of influence, and the invisible currents of an empire that moves with precision and quiet terror. You will see how a soldier became a strategist, how a man became a ghost, and how power can be exercised most effectively when it is unseen. Lean back, breathe deeply, and let the desert winds carry you into the story of El Lazca, the ghost who vanished without a trace. Northern Mexico stretched endlessly under the weight of heat, dust, and silence. The sun had long sunk behind jagged mountains, leaving a twilight that bled into night, casting muted purples and deep oranges across cracked earth. The desert seemed alive in its stillness, a faint rustle of dry brush, a distant owl hooting, the subtle shift of sand as the wind whispered secrets through the valleys. Every shadow held a story, every gust carried a whisper of the world beyond sight. In the midst of this vast expanse, a figure moved with a calm, measured purpose. His steps left traces that the wind would soon erase, and his silhouette blended almost imperceptibly with the dunes. Heriberto Lazcano, though few dared speak the name aloud, was there, a presence felt rather than seen. Those who had encountered him in any capacity knew instinctively that this man was different. There was a quiet authority to him, a weight that needed no words to assert itself. He was known as El Lazca, a ghost moving among the living, commanding loyalty and fear without ever raising his voice. He paused at the crest of a small dune, letting his eyes sweep across the horizon. Tiny fires flickered in distant settlements, their smoke carried faintly on the night air. A line of figures could be seen in the shadow of a canyon, travelers, merchants, or perhaps men scouting the desert, but none noticed him. To the untrained eye, he was merely another shadow, another bend in the land. But to those who understood the desert's unspoken rules, to those attuned to power that moved silently, he was far more. Heriberto's mind drifted through patterns. Every movement, every signal in the wind, every flicker of light was data. It had to be, for he had learned early that in the world he inhabited, knowledge was the most lethal weapon. He had once been a soldier, disciplined in the art of war, taught to follow orders and execute strategies without hesitation. Yet Lazcano had realized something fundamental. The loudest weapons often drew attention, and attention could be fatal. True mastery, he understood, lay in patience, observation, and the quiet orchestration of events from behind the curtain. As night deepened, the desert cooled, and the shadows grew longer, his thoughts drifted to the past. Memories arrived unbidden, drills under scorching suns, marches that blurred into exhaustion, nights spent listening to the crackling of fires in foreign territories. Each experience had been a building block, not only of his skill but of his understanding of people, their fears, their loyalties, and their ambitions. Lazcano had learned that fear could be cultivated, loyalty earned without speeches, and respect commanded without declarations. In those early years as a soldier, he had mastered the delicate art of perception, and it had stayed with him when he left that life behind. When he moved, it was deliberate. Every step was calculated, every gesture measured. The wind shifted, brushing against his face, carrying the scent of dust, mesquite, and distant smoke. It reminded him that the world was never entirely silent, that stories traveled on currents invisible to most. He listened, not impatiently, not anxiously, but with an attentiveness honed over years of watching, waiting, and learning. Every rustle could signal opportunity, every pause could signal threat. And so he moved through the night as he always had, unnoticed, yet profoundly present. The desert, in all its stark beauty, mirrored the man himself. Unyielding, vast, and full of hidden depth. It offered few comforts, and Lazcano had learned to take none. Survival here depended on awareness, patience, and understanding the subtleties of power. Just as a shift in the wind could reveal the movement of an unseen animal, subtle gestures could reveal truths about men, their intentions, their weaknesses, their loyalties. He had come to read people as carefully as he read the land. The first stars appeared overhead, scattered across the dark canvas of night. Their cold, distant light reminded him of the larger universe, of forces far beyond the desert and its fleeting struggles. And yet, here, in this place where dust hung like mist and shadows moved like living creatures, Lazcano's influence was absolute. Men obeyed, territories were secured, and rumors of his presence traveled faster than any messenger. He had no need for spectacle. The desert itself carried the echoes of his authority. He crouched briefly behind a ridge, observing a small group of riders approaching from the east. They were oblivious to him, their horses kicking up faint trails of sand, their conversations hushed but audible to those attuned. Lazcano noted the cadence of their voices, the tension in their shoulders, the way their eyes flicked to the horizon. Each detail mattered. Each detail could be leveraged, observed, or dismissed. He understood the desert not only as a landscape but as a theater in which human actions unfolded, revealing intentions and vulnerabilities. A soft breeze carried the faint scent of gunpowder from a distant skirmish, likely between rival groups far beyond his reach tonight. It barely registered to him, not for lack of concern, but because he had learned that not all disturbances required intervention. He could wait, let events play out, and act only when necessary. That patience, that understanding of timing, was part of what made him formidable. To strike too early was to invite chaos, to strike too late was to forfeit control. Lazcano existed in that narrow space of perfect timing, moving like a shadow, striking only when it served the strategy. The night deepened, and he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The desert had been both teacher and companion. It had shaped him, hardened him, and offered him lessons that no formal training could provide. He remembered nights when the wind screamed through the canyons, rattling tents and shaking men to their cores, and he had sat in silence, learning the language of patience. The desert spoke of endurance, of observation, of the quiet supremacy of those who could read it well. And he had learned. He shifted his weight and moved forward, silent as the sand slipping beneath his boots. His eyes caught a faint glimmer, a reflection of moonlight off a distant water source. It was nothing significant, yet he noted it. Attention to detail had always been his creed. Small signals often carried meaning, and small actions often determined outcomes. Every step was a calculation, every pause was a measurement. Lazcano had made a career of existing in spaces where others were blind, and tonight was no exception. The desert stretched on endlessly, an ocean of sand and rock. Each movement he made seemed to dissolve into the wind, leaving no trace, yet leaving an indelible mark on those who had encountered him before. He had learned that influence did not require visibility, that command could exist in the unseen. To be remembered was not to make noise, it was to make presence undeniable even when absent. By the time the moon rose high, pale and serene, he had reached a solitary ridge overlooking a valley below. Fires from distant settlements glimmered faintly, and the occasional shadow of movement hinted at life in the darkness. He watched quietly, noting the rhythms of the land, the subtle shifts in human activity, and the way the desert seemed to respond to him. In his silence there was authority. In his patience there was strategy. And in his presence, even unseen, there was fear. Heriberto Lazcano did not belong entirely to this world, nor did he belong entirely to the next. He was a man of shadows, a master of patience, and a student of silence. And as the night stretched on, the wind whispered through the valleys, carrying his presence like a secret across the desert. To those who understood, he was already a legend. To those who did not, he was merely a shadow among shadows. And somewhere in that vast quiet expanse he moved again, unseen, unheard, yet profoundly present, Lazca, the ghost of northern Mexico, commanding attention without a sound, shaping the world in the language of silence, preparing for a story that would be remembered not for what was done loudly, but for what was done quietly, invisibly, irrevocably. Long before the desert shadows had whispered his name, Heriberto Lazcano had walked a different path, one marked by order, discipline, and the relentless rhythm of military life. He was not born a ghost, nor a legend. He had been molded, shaped by harsh sunlight, the endless drills of the barracks, and the rigid expectations of those who demanded obedience without question. Every day, from dawn until dusk, Lazcano had learned that life could be measured not in years, but in seconds, in movements, in the subtle alignment of body and mind to a singular purpose. The barracks were hot, suffused with the smell of sweat and metal, the sharp tang of gunpowder lingering even after drills had ended. Soldiers moved in unison, their boots thudding against hard-packed dirt, rifles clutched in hands that were both steady and trained. Lazcano had once been one of them, a boy learning to harness fear, to master the instincts that separated the cautious from the prepared. His instructors barked orders, their voices a constant barrage, Yet he learned to hear not only the words but the silences between them. In those silences, he understood timing, strategy, and the subtle power of anticipation. Nights in the barracks were no less instructive. The desert cooled and the wind rattled the corrugated roofs, carrying with it stories from far-off villages, rumors of raids and whispers of unrest. Lazcano would lie awake on the thin mattress, listening to the faint sounds of the world, cataloging them, making them part of a mental map that few could imagine. Each creak of the floorboards, each whisper, each faint shuffle outside the tent was data, and he would memorize it all. He had learned early that the world rarely shouted the information one truly needed. It hid it in subtle movements, in small details, in the quiet spaces where others failed to look. It was during these years that Lazcano discovered the essential truth that would define him. True power lies in observation, in understanding, and in silence. While other men sought recognition, honed their presence through bravado or loud orders, he cultivated the invisible. A soldier who could anticipate, who could move unseen, who could bend circumstances to his will without raising a hand or voice. Such a man would command respect not because of strength alone, but because of omnipresence in thought, even if unseen. His instructors tried to impress upon him that war was chaos, and chaos demanded action. Lazcano disagreed silently. Chaos could be harnessed if one moved with clarity, if one predicted the ripples before they became waves. While his peers sought to dominate through noise and aggression, he learned patience, timing, and the subtle art of influence. In drills, he anticipated commands before they were fully given. In exercises, he predicted the movements of his comrades, adjusting his own with uncanny precision. Slowly, quietly, he began to separate himself from the pack, not in arrogance but in understanding. By the time he was deployed in real operations, the lessons of the barracks had crystallized into instinct. He moved with a calm certainty, always observing, always calculating. Each village he entered, each patrol he led, was a canvas upon which he painted his mastery of timing, patience, and foresight. Lazcano became adept at reading people as one might read terrain, noting hesitation, assessing reaction, calculating risk. The desert, the towns, the soldiers he led, they all became instruments in a symphony whose conductor was invisible. It was during one particularly grueling patrol that Lazcano first understood the weight of fear, not his own but the fear of others. A small group of rebels had been spotted near a remote canyon, armed and prepared. Lazcano and his unit were tasked with interception. But instead of charging with the noise and clamor his superiors expected, he chose patience. He observed the men from the shadows, cataloging their routines, noting the rhythm of their movements, waiting for the precise moment when action would yield maximum impact with minimal exposure. When the moment came, he moved silently, coordinating his team with subtle signals, a glance, a hand gesture, a shift in posture. The operation unfolded like clockwork. Not a single unnecessary noise. Not a single misstep. And when it was over, the impact was total. The rebels were incapacitated, the operation deemed flawless, yet from the outside, it had seemed almost miraculous. That day, Lazcano understood more deeply the principle that would guide him for the rest of his life. Command need not be loud, influence need not be visible. After returning from deployments, Lazcano carried these lessons into the civilian world with him. But the world he entered was far less predictable than the disciplined barracks or even the structured campaigns of the military. Northern Mexico in those years was a land of opportunity and peril, where violence and corruption intertwined with commerce and ambition. Men with courage but little strategy could thrive for a time, yet only those with patience, cunning, and an understanding of fear could endure. Lazcano observed, waited, and planned. He saw the emergence of small groups, local gangs, and paramilitary organizations attempting to assert control. Many were loud, many were visible, many sought attention they were unprepared to sustain. Lazcano knew he would never compete in that way. Instead, he built his own network quietly, recruiting men who were skilled, disciplined, and loyal. Men who understood, as he did, that influence was a matter of perception and subtlety, not public display. During these years, Lazcano became a ghost in more than name. He moved among these nascent organizations with discretion, assessing strengths and weaknesses, forming alliances where convenient, neutralizing threats where necessary. His reputation grew, whispered among those who understood subtlety, feared by those who mistook visibility for power. He learned to balance control and absence, to govern with authority while remaining unseen, a principle that would later define the empire he co-founded, Los Zetas. And yet, even as he mastered these strategies, Lazcano was aware of the cost. Silence required discipline. Observation required patience. Influence required constant vigilance. He could never be distracted by ego, by recognition, by the desire to be noticed. To do so was to risk exposure, to risk losing the advantage he had cultivated with painstaking care. The desert had taught him endurance, the barracks had taught him discipline, and the streets of northern Mexico were teaching him the delicate art of invisibility, the skill of being everywhere without being seen, knowing everything without revealing himself. By the time he had established his first true foothold in the criminal landscape, Lazcano was no longer simply a man. He was a presence, an idea, a shadow that moved among men and territories with deliberate purpose. His understanding of strategy, timing, and human behavior gave him an almost preternatural advantage. Those who encountered him understood instinctively that this was a man whose patience was as formidable as his ability to act decisively, whose silence carried the weight of authority heavier than the loudest command. In quiet moments he reflected on the man he had become. The boy who had once marched in uniform, following orders unquestioningly, had evolved into a master of subtlety, a conductor of unseen events. He had learned that true power lay not in the spectacle of violence, but in the precise orchestration of outcomes, in the management of perception, and in the cultivation of loyalty through trust and fear combined. The desert, which had once been the backdrop for his nights of observation and reflection, now seemed to whisper in approval. He had become what he was meant to be, a ghost among men, a shadow in motion, a strategist whose name would one day evoke both respect and fear without a single shout, without a single dramatic gesture. Heriberto Lazcano had become El Lazca, the man who would later co-found Los Zetas, but in this chapter of his life he was still forming, still learning, still perfecting the silent, invisible methods that would define his legacy. He had mastered patience, observation, and discretion, skills honed in the barracks, refined in the desert, and tested in the volatile world beyond. By the time the stars stretched across the night sky, he had already begun to see the patterns, to anticipate the flows of power, and to understand the movements of men who were yet unaware of his influence. The ghost was taking shape, not yet fully visible, not yet fully realized, but emerging with the deliberate precision of someone who understood that in the dance of power, it is often the unseen hand that dictates the rhythm. As he walked through the desert under the watchful gaze of the moon, Heriberto Lazcano felt the weight of the lessons he had learned. The barracks, the drills, the patrols, all of it had built a foundation, and now the world beyond was testing the edifice he had constructed. He moved quietly, blending with shadows, observing with patience, calculating each step, each glance, each decision. The man he was becoming would one day command territories, influence lives, and inspire stories whispered across deserts and borders. But for now he was a soldier still, learning the subtleties of strategy, timing, and power in a world that demanded silence as much as action. And in the stillness of that northern Mexican night, with the wind carrying dust across the valleys and the stars scattered cold and distant above, the transformation continued. The boy had become a man, the man would become a ghost, and the ghost would one day walk among men in ways that no one could anticipate, commanding attention not by noise, but by presence, patience, and the invisible authority that comes from mastering both self and world. The years following Lazcano's gradual mastery of patience, observation, and subtle authority were formative, not only for him, but for the future of a world he would come to dominate in shadows. Northern Mexico was a land of contrast. Harsh deserts and fertile valleys, lawless towns and bustling settlements, whispered allegiances and sudden betrayals. It was a terrain both physical and psychological, and Lazcano understood that controlling it required more than brute force. It required vision, discipline, and silence. He began to observe the small groups, militias, and criminal factions that operated across the northern territories. Each had its weaknesses. Some relied too heavily on aggression, others were impulsive, and most were noisy, drawing attention that made them vulnerable. Lazcano noted every detail, the patterns of movement, the habits of leaders, the loyalty of followers. He catalogued all these observations mentally, creating a map not only of geography but of influence in human behavior. Every village, every crossroads, every faction was a potential node in a network he was slowly designing. It was during these observations that Lazcano realized the true potential of disciplined, trained men. He had once led soldiers who obeyed orders without hesitation, who could anticipate strategy, who moved like a single organism. He recognized that such precision could be applied outside the army, in the realm of organized crime. And so he began to recruit, not recklessly, not impulsively, but deliberately, seeking men who understood control, who could follow a vision, and who would move quietly yet decisively. The first recruits were former soldiers, men who had been trained in the discipline Lazcano valued. They understood the power of observation, the necessity of timing, and the art of psychological influence. Unlike most recruits in criminal organizations, they did not crave notoriety. They valued effectiveness, precision, and loyalty. Together, they formed the nucleus of what would become Los Zetas, a force designed to operate with military efficiency, strategic patience, and near invisibility. In the early stages, Lazcano insisted on strict protocols. Orders were communicated in code, often through subtle gestures or messages carried by trusted intermediaries. Meetings were conducted in darkness or in remote locations. Every movement was tracked, every conversation noted. There was no room for ego, no tolerance for recklessness. Lazcano understood that in this world visibility could be fatal. Power was not in appearances. Power was in execution, discipline, and control. Northern Mexico, with its sprawling deserts and remote mountain passes, provided the perfect environment for such a network to develop. Lazcano used geography to his advantage, positioning his men strategically, ensuring communication lines remained secure, and that surveillance of rival groups was constant. Even the natural environment, the shifting sands, the patterns of wind and night, was part of his strategy. He taught his men to move with the same awareness he had honed as a soldier, to anticipate not only human behavior but environmental variables that could affect outcomes. The network grew cautiously, and with growth came refinement. Lazcano emphasized that every action must serve the overarching strategy. A confrontation was only undertaken if it guaranteed a measurable outcome. Operations were rehearsed, contingencies considered, escape routes plotted. He instilled in his men the principle that violence was a tool, not a spectacle. When it occurred, it would be precise, controlled, and effective. The discipline he demanded was exacting, but it produced results that set his group apart from the chaotic, unpredictable factions around them. Yet Lazcano's genius lay not only in operational control, but in psychological influence. He understood fear better than most men understood ambition. The reputation of Los Zetas spread not merely through their actions, but through the perception of their omnipresence. Even when Lazcano was not physically present, the knowledge that he could be anywhere, observing, calculating, striking, kept rivals cautious and followers disciplined. He had become a ghost in the minds of men, a shadow that dictated behavior without moving a hand. The early successes of this network reinforced the methodology Lazcano had cultivated for years. Operations were carried out with surgical precision. Rival groups were neutralized before they realized the threat. Men who had previously relied on bravado and aggression now encountered a force that was invisible, disciplined, and patient. Lazcano's philosophy was simple yet profound. Control the perception of power, and the power itself follows naturally. Over time, Los Zetas evolved into more than a group. They became an organization with its own identity, rules, and hierarchy. Lazcano insisted that loyalty be absolute but not blind. Men were expected to observe, to report, to anticipate threats, and to act decisively within the parameters he set. Training was continuous, with emphasis on strategic thinking, tactical awareness, and psychological insight. Each member was molded not only to follow orders, but to understand the principles behind them, to internalize the strategy so fully that their actions were extensions of Lazcano's own mind. The desert continued to be both classroom and proving ground. Nights were spent observing, listening, and learning. Dunes became vantage points, small towns, nodes for information. Lazcano taught his men to read subtle signs, a shift in the wind, the movement of shadows, the cadence of a distant conversation. Each of these details could be leveraged to gain advantage. The mastery of such nuances, he believed, distinguished men who commanded from men who merely followed. Despite the rigor, Lazcano remained elusive, almost spectral. Even his closest allies often encountered him unexpectedly, sensing rather than seeing him first. This aura of mystery reinforced loyalty and fear. He spoke rarely, yet when he did, his words were precise, deliberate, and impactful. His silence was not a void, but a tool, a way to make every statement carry weight, every order resonate beyond its immediate context. During these formative years of Los Zetas, Lazcano also learned to manage unpredictability. Human nature is never entirely rational, and in the chaos of rival groups, government forces, and internal ambition, adaptability was crucial. He cultivated the ability to assess rapidly, adjust strategies, and act decisively without hesitation. Patience, observation, and the calculated application of force became his signature. There were nights when the desert tested him. Moonless nights where the wind carried nothing but uncertainty, where sounds could deceive and shadows could mislead. Lazcano welcomed these nights. They were lessons in attention, awareness, and calm under pressure. Each challenge, each potential threat, was absorbed into his strategy, strengthening his capacity to operate silently yet effectively. The desert, once a passive backdrop, had become a partner in his methodology, a mirror reflecting the precision and patience he demanded of himself and his men. By the time Los Zetas had fully formed into a disciplined, feared, and strategically potent organization, Lazcano's transformation was complete. He was no longer simply a soldier, nor merely a man. He had become something beyond, a ghost among men, a presence whose influence extended far beyond physical visibility. He had forged an empire of discipline, loyalty, and fear, and he had done so without noise, without spectacle, relying entirely on strategy, precision, and psychological mastery. The legend of Los Zetas was not built on chaos or flamboyant violence. It was built on control, observation, and the silent execution of power. Those who encountered the group or even heard whispers of its presence, understood instinctively that this was an organization unlike any other. Its leader, Heriberto Lazcano, had demonstrated that the truest command does not come from shouting, but from creating an environment where obedience, fear, and respect are cultivated invisibly, with patience, and maintained by the omnipresent awareness of a mind operating beyond the reach of most men. And so, as the night stretched across northern Mexico, as the wind shifted across dunes and canyons, and as shadows deepened in the quiet towns below, Lazcano moved among his men as he had always done, unseen, calculating, patient. The organization that would come to dominate the northern territories of Mexico was no longer just a concept. It was a living entity, a ghostly extension of his mind. And in its silence, it spoke volumes, of discipline, of strategy, of the quiet, invisible power of a man who had learned to command without ever raising his voice. Heriberto Lazcano had become not only a leader but a principle incarnate. That power, like the desert wind, can move unnoticed, yet shape everything it touches. And in the unfolding darkness, the ghost was at work, orchestrating the rise of Los Zetas, preparing to leave a mark on the world that would endure long after the footsteps that created it had vanished. By the time Los Zetas had grown from a small, disciplined cadre of former soldiers into a formidable network, Lazcano had come to understand the most potent instrument at his disposal: silence. It was not merely the absence of words, but a deliberate, calculated strategy, a way to exert authority without exposing vulnerability. In a world where every gesture could be misinterpreted, every whisper could become rumor, and every decision could have violent consequences, Lazcano had learned that silence was not emptiness, it was control. Northern Mexico was quiet at night, not from peace, but from the stillness of expectation. The desert wind carried nothing but the shifting sands and the occasional distant cry of a coyote. It was in these quiet nights that Lazcano thrived. He moved among his men like a ghost, unseen yet omnipresent, observing patterns, testing loyalty, and reinforcing authority with subtlety. Orders were given not through speeches or demonstrations of force, but through carefully constructed signals, trusted intermediaries, and the unspoken understanding that disobedience was a risk no man could afford. He often walked among camps in the dead of night, a figure absorbed in the shadows, watching how men moved, how they spoke to one another, and how they reacted under pressure. Even the smallest lapse, a hesitation, a glance away, a misstep, was noted. Lazcano did not speak immediately, did not punish openly. Instead, he allowed the observation to sink in, letting the knowledge of his watchful presence settle in the minds of his followers. The realization that he might always be observing, that every action could be registered and assessed, created a discipline far more effective than any shouted command. To Lazcano, silence was layered with meaning. A pause could convey expectation, a gaze could demand loyalty, a simple nod could authorize action. The men learned quickly that what he did not say carried as much weight as what he did. They internalized the rules, anticipating consequences before they occurred. The desert itself seemed to participate in this education, its quiet vastness echoing the discipline Lazcano expected. Night after night, the wind, the sand, and the stars were his accomplices, reinforcing the subtlety, the patience, and the quiet precision he demanded. He would sometimes convene small groups to convey instructions, but even in these moments he spoke minimally. A sentence was measured, concise, and loaded with intent. Misunderstanding was not tolerated. Clarity was achieved through brevity and repetition of principle rather than explanation. Lazcano knew that the human mind retains what it interprets and fears. The men learned to listen not just with their ears, but with attention to context, environment and tone, or lack thereof. In the absence of flamboyance, every subtlety became amplified. Orders for operations were communicated in ways that preserved secrecy and minimized exposure. Messages were carried by trusted couriers, sometimes encrypted, sometimes simple, always deliberate. Strategic points were monitored silently, reconnaissance conducted with precision, and contingencies considered for every plausible scenario. Lazcano's men operated as extensions of his mind, their actions anticipated, their loyalty maintained not through fear of immediate reprisal, but through the unshakable awareness that he was always watching, always assessing, always in control. The psychological dimension of command was central to his power. Lazcano understood the human propensity to seek approval, fear disapproval, and respond to expectation. He created a system in which his men internalized the hierarchy, the values, and the standards without constant reinforcement. Silence was the teacher. Observation was the curriculum. The desert, the settlements, and the network itself became living classrooms where obedience, strategy, and anticipation were learned and perfected. He extended this principle beyond his own cadre. Rival groups, local authorities, and the broader population understood, in subtle ways, that Los Zetas operated differently. They were not loud, not reckless, and not easily provoked. Yet their presence was felt in the shadows, their influence spread through observation of patterns, rumors, and indirect consequences. Lazcano had transformed the concept of power into something almost ethereal. It was perception, control, and absence fused into a single strategy. In these years he refined what would become his signature approach: move silently, act decisively, and let absence amplify presence. Where other leaders relied on spectacle, threats, or chaos, Lazcano relied on precision, discipline, and the knowledge that fear is often most effective when quietly insinuated into the minds of men. He did not need to display might. He merely needed to exist as the ghost in the corner of perception, the mind that saw all, the force that could strike invisibly and with certainty. Even mundane matters were approached with deliberate thought. Lazcano would observe the flow of daily life in settlements under his influence. The movement of traders, the rhythm of patrols, the gestures exchanged between men in his employ. Small signals, who smiled at whom, who hesitated, who questioned orders, were catalogued. Each minor detail fed into his mental map, strengthening both operational planning and psychological leverage. To outsiders, these acts may have seemed trivial, inconsequential, yet to Lazcano they were essential components of control. Over time, the combination of strict discipline, psychological insight, and operational precision created a culture of silent efficiency. Los Zetas became feared not for ostentatious displays of power, but for their unpredictability and omnipresence. To challenge them was to confront an entity whose awareness extended far beyond immediate perception, whose influence operated through the subtle orchestration of people, territory, and information. Lazcano's presence, even when unseen, was woven into every decision, every action, every hesitation. It was not power alone that elevated him, but the understanding of influence. Lazcano taught his men that obedience could be achieved without shouting, fear could be instilled without violence, and loyalty could be maintained without constant supervision. In essence, he had created a new paradigm of command, the silent, invisible authority that shapes outcomes more effectively than any weapon or speech. Even as Los Zetas expanded, the principles remained consistent. Lazcano ensured that every recruit, every operation, and every contingency adhered to the doctrines of observation, silence, and precision. A lapse in discipline was corrected discreetly, a betrayal neutralized swiftly but subtly, and success measured not by headlines or recognition, but by outcomes achieved with minimal exposure. The organization operated like a living organism, its components moving in synchrony, each anticipating the needs of the whole, each acting in alignment with the invisible hand of its architect. At night, he would sometimes find himself alone, staring at the stars above the desert. The vastness of the sky reminded him of the scale of his undertaking, the magnitude of influence he wielded, and the subtlety required to maintain control. His past as a soldier had prepared him for discipline, the present demanded strategy, and the future required a mastery of perception and timing that few could comprehend. In the silence of these hours, Lazcano found clarity, refining not only plans and operations, but his own understanding of power. It was during these hours that he contemplated the duality of visibility and absence. To be seen was to be vulnerable. To be invisible was to command the imagination of all who perceived your reach. Los Zetas had become an extension of this principle, a network whose existence was felt far more than observed, whose influence permeated decisions and behaviors without overt interference. Lazcano had taught his men to internalize this philosophy, ensuring that every action, every observation, and every choice contributed to the silent projection of authority. By the time dawn approached, painting the desert with muted streaks of orange and pink, Lazcano had completed his nightly rounds of observation and reflection. The wind had shifted, carrying sand across the dunes, and the distant settlements were beginning to stir with the first signs of morning activity. Yet, within his mind and across his network, the influence of the night's observations had already been registered, decisions had been anticipated, and actions silently planned. Heriberto Lazcano, through the deliberate mastery of silence, had transformed Los Zetas into more than a group of men with weapons. They had become a disciplined, invisible force, an organization that exerted influence without overt display, that commanded loyalty and fear through the careful calibration of perception and subtle action. And it was all anchored in the principle he had honed through years of training, observation, and reflection. Power lies not in noise but in presence, not in spectacle but in subtle, persistent authority. As the sun began to rise over the northern horizon, casting long shadows across the desert, Lazcano remained a figure apart, a ghostly presence guiding the movements of men who would later become legends in their own right. The empire he was building was not one of chaos or noise, it was one of precision, discipline, and quiet command. And in the stillness of the desert morning, the lesson was clear. The strongest influence is the one that is felt, even when unseen, and obeyed, even when unspoken. The desert at night carried an ancient rhythm, one that only a few could truly understand. For Heriberto Lazcano, this rhythm was a language, a code written in the movement of sand, the shift of shadows, and the subtle changes of wind. The northern Mexican landscape was vast and unforgiving, yet within its emptiness Lazcano saw patterns invisible to most. Every ridge, every canyon, every sparse cluster of vegetation was part of a network, a set of nodes that could either support or threaten his ambitions. He stood on the edge of a ridge overlooking a valley that stretched for miles. Fires from distant settlements flickered like pinpricks of orange against the dark earth. Horses stirred quietly in the pens, their soft movements muffled by the sand. The air was dry and carried the faint smell of mesquite and dust, punctuated by distant smoke from cooking fires. To anyone else, the valley was simply a quiet stretch of land. To Lazcano, it was a map, alive with signals, risks, and opportunities. His men were dispersed across strategic points, each positioned with careful consideration. Scouts moved silently along ridgelines, monitoring for signs of intrusion. Observers watched settlement entrances, noting the arrival and departure of individuals, the rhythm of activity, and subtle shifts in behavior. Lazcano did not need to issue loud commands. Instead, his presence was implicit, communicated through prior instruction, coded gestures, and the unspoken understanding that he was always observing. As he crouched behind a ridge, Lazcano allowed his mind to trace the movements below. A caravan of merchants entered a nearby village. Their pace, their formation, the spacing between wagons, all suggested routine, but he noted small anomalies. A man walking slightly ahead of the group, scanning the surroundings, a mule that seemed restless, a door opening that didn't align with the usual activity. Each anomaly was catalogued, assessed, and stored in his mental map. Such details might seem inconsequential to others, but Lazcano knew that power lies in noticing what others ignore. He reflected on the men under his command. Each had been carefully selected, trained not only in combat but in observation, in patience, in discretion. They were extensions of his senses, each acting according to protocols and contingencies he had developed over years. Orders were rarely given directly. Instead, he relied on anticipation and initiative, instructing men to interpret situations based on principles rather than explicit instructions. In doing so, he created an organization capable of acting autonomously yet coherently, as though the mind of its leader were dispersed across the landscape. The desert had taught him patience, and observation had become his primary tool. Even minor disturbances were not ignored. A flicker of light, a shadow misaligned, a distant noise, all were analyzed, their significance weighed against potential threats or opportunities. Lazcano had learned that a single overlooked detail could cascade into catastrophe. Thus, his nightly watches were meticulous, deliberate, and unwavering. He moved slowly, blending with the terrain, his senses heightened to every nuance. Night after night, Lazcano established routines that reinforced both control and perception. Scouts reported patterns, observers relayed minor anomalies, and in turn Lazcano adjusted deployments without ever being seen. His influence was felt rather than observed. The men understood that any action, any inaction, any hesitation could have consequences, and this understanding created an internalized discipline stronger than fear alone. He occasionally allowed himself a rare glance at the stars, noting their position, their consistency. The constancy of celestial bodies contrasted sharply with the volatility of the world below. It reminded him that control, while situational, could be absolute if approached with calculation and patience. The desert, in its stillness, became both ally and teacher, reinforcing principles he had long internalized: observation, restraint, and the quiet projection of influence. From this vantage he could see rival factions moving along distant trails. Their formations were uneven, their coordination imperfect, their attention scattered. He catalogued their strengths, their tendencies, and their predictable errors. He understood that direct confrontation was rarely necessary. The threat could be neutralized through strategic positioning, anticipation, and psychological influence. Lazcano had become a master of the unseen game, orchestrating outcomes before others were even aware of the contest. As the night deepened, a group of men approached one of his outposts, a routine check from a neighboring sector. Their approach was methodical, disciplined, yet Lazcano noted their subtle hesitations, the slight misalignment in their steps, the flicker of unease in their eyes. It was a minor deviation, yet meaningful. He considered how best to reinforce principles without disrupting efficiency. Often, correction was subtle. A reassignment, a quiet reminder, a shift in responsibility. The men internalized these lessons, learning that discipline was not enforced loudly but embedded in practice. The desert, the stars, and the wind had become part of his strategy, extensions of his perception. He taught his men to move as though guided by the rhythm of the land, to listen as closely to the silence as to the sounds of movement, to anticipate both human and environmental shifts. Every night offered lessons, and Lazcano absorbed them all. The natural world reinforced the philosophy that power is most effective when it is pervasive yet imperceptible. By the early hours of the morning, Lazcano had completed his patrol. The valley lay quiet, fires dimmed, and the men had returned to their assigned positions. Yet the network of influence extended far beyond physical observation. The reputation of Los Zetas, the knowledge that Lazca could be watching, created a psychological environment of vigilance, respect, and restraint. Even those who had never met him were influenced by the perception of his omnipresence. In these moments of solitude, Lazcano contemplated the paradox of his power. The more invisible he remained, the more tangible his authority became. His men were empowered to act independently within the bounds he had established, yet remained aware that deviation could carry consequences. Rival factions hesitated before moving, constrained not by force alone, but by the uncertainty of unseen oversight. Silence had become a language, observation a method of governance, and absence a source of influence. As dawn approached, the desert slowly began to reveal its colors, muted purples giving way to pale pinks, sand shifting under the first light of day. Lazcano stood atop the ridge, observing the terrain one last time before withdrawing to a hidden path. He had mapped every trail, noted every settlement, and assessed every movement of significance. The desert was under his watch, not through direct control, but through the pervasive reach of his vision, strategy, and psychological presence. Heriberto Lazcano had become more than a man. He was a ghost of the desert, a strategist whose authority permeated territory, behavior, and perception. The network he had constructed was alive, responsive, and guided by principles he alone had instilled. And as he retreated into shadow, unseen and unchallenged, the desert seemed to acknowledge his mastery, the wind whispering through the dunes carrying the subtle echo of a presence that was felt, feared, and respected, even when absent. This was the essence of the desert watcher, a leader who observed with patience, influenced through subtlety, and commanded without sound. His authority radiated outward from him, touching every element of his environment, and embedding a culture of discipline, loyalty, and vigilance. The legend of Lazcano was born not from loud displays of power, but from the meticulous, silent orchestration of men, movements, and terrain, a force as intangible and pervasive as the desert wind itself. The first light of dawn cast a pale glow across the desert, illuminating the undulating dunes and jagged ridges of northern Mexico. The world seemed to awaken slowly, each movement deliberate, measured, as though the land itself respected the rules of patience and observation that Heriberto Lazcano had come to embody. Atop a ridge, he stood surveying the terrain with the practiced eyes of a man who had long learned that control need not be loud to be absolute. Below him, His men moved with silent precision, carrying out instructions that had been disseminated hours, or even days, before. There were no shouted commands, no flags raised in visibility, no demonstrations of force. Orders traveled invisibly, conveyed through a combination of pre-established protocols, subtle signals, and the understanding that Lazcano was always watching. In this ecosystem of discipline, the ordinary became extraordinary simply through the meticulous orchestration of action and observation. A messenger emerged from the shadows, approaching a distant observation point. He carried only a small notebook and a ciphered message, both tools of communication in a network that valued subtlety above spectacle. The man approached the ridge, nodded once to Lazcano and retreated, his movements as quiet as the desert wind. This was how coordination occurred. Small, precise, virtually undetectable. Each participant understood that their awareness, timing, and discretion were critical to success. Lazcano's mind processed every detail: the position of scouts, the patterns of settlements, the behaviors of rival groups, and even the smallest nuances in the rhythm of his men's patrols. These factors were constantly analyzed, cross-referenced, and integrated into a living map of influence. Every action, every inaction, every minor deviation had potential consequences, and Lazcano was always several steps ahead, ensuring that outcomes aligned with his broader strategic vision. He remembered early lessons from his military training. Direct force was only effective when applied judiciously. Overexposure could be fatal. It was a principle he had applied to the formation of Los Zetas and continued to refine in every operation. Orders were not simply instructions. They were extensions of his own perception, designed to anticipate needs, prevent mistakes, and maintain cohesion without overt supervision. The men had internalized these expectations. They acted with a combination of initiative and discipline that made them extensions of Lazcano's mind. In one secluded canyon, a group of operatives prepared for a movement that, to the casual observer, appeared unremarkable. They approached a remote settlement to assess activity, noting patterns, timing, and potential threats. Lazcano had instructed them in advance, using a system of signals and cues that required no vocal commands. Each operative knew precisely when to act, how to move, and what to report. Their coordination was flawless, a testament to both training and the implicit understanding that disobedience or hesitation could never be tolerated, even subtly. The genius of Lazcano's approach lay not only in the precision of operations but in the psychology of perception. Those outside the network, including rival factions and the local populace, never saw the orchestration directly. Yet they felt it. They sensed an invisible hand shaping events, guiding movements, and enforcing consequences. This perception, though intangible, was as powerful as any display of force. Fear and respect were cultivated not through spectacle, but through anticipation of unseen oversight, the understanding that Lazcano's influence could extend into spaces where he was physically absent. Throughout the morning he moved between vantage points, scanning distant trails and valleys, occasionally observing settlements that were strategically significant. He noted changes in activity: a wagon moving differently than usual, a faint disturbance in the sand where someone had passed unnoticed, the glint of sunlight reflecting off metal objects in the distance. Each observation added a layer to his mental model, informing decisions, adjusting priorities, and refining the deployment of resources. Information, even subtle, was a weapon, and Lazcano wielded it with the precision of a master craftsman. Occasionally he would allow himself a rare reflection. The desert, with its vastness and solitude, reinforced lessons he had internalized over years: patience, observation, subtlety, and the silent exercise of power. He considered the broader implications of his strategy: how the silent execution of orders could maintain cohesion, enforce loyalty, and cultivate fear, all without the visibility and potential exposure of overt action. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant attention, but it amplified his authority immeasurably. The quieter the influence, the more enduring it became. By midday the network had completed several minor operations, all executed without fanfare, all successful. Intelligence had been gathered, threats neutralized, and positions reinforced, all while remaining effectively invisible to rivals. Lazcano moved quietly among the periphery of activity, observing, noting, adjusting. He had mastered a form of command in which the presence of leadership was felt more than seen, where outcomes were achieved efficiently, and where discipline and psychological impact were embedded in every action. Even the ordinary routines of his organization reflected this philosophy. Logistics, supply lines, patrol rotations, and training schedules were all designed with the principle of invisible guidance. Men were trained to anticipate needs, report anomalies, and respond to contingencies without waiting for explicit instruction. This decentralized execution allowed for flexibility while maintaining cohesion. A network that operated like a single organism, its intelligence distributed yet synchronized through shared understanding and the ever-present shadow of Lazcano's influence. By the time the sun began its descent, casting long shifting shadows across dunes and valleys, Lazcano had reviewed the day's operations and noted areas requiring adjustment. Small deviations were corrected discreetly. Lessons were integrated into ongoing training and observation. The network had performed flawlessly, yet each member was reminded, silently, that vigilance was constant, that perception was critical, and that the unseen hand of leadership always watched. As night fell again, he retreated to a solitary ridge, observing the valley below. The wind carried dust, scent, and faint sound. Fires in distant settlements flickered softly, shadows shifted subtly, and the world seemed to hum with potential. Lazcano allowed himself a quiet smile. Orders had been executed without noise, influence exerted without confrontation, and authority reinforced without spectacle. Power, he knew, was most effective when invisible, subtle, and pervasive. In the solitude of the desert night, Lazcano's thoughts drifted briefly to the future. The network he had built, disciplined through silent observation and internalized authority, was poised for expansion. He understood that his methods, orders without noise, influence without visibility, and leadership without overt display, would become the hallmark of Los Zetas' dominance. The organization would thrive not because of intimidation alone, but because of the pervasive psychological presence cultivated in every member, every settlement, every rival, and every observer. By midnight, the valley was quiet again, shadows pooling and shifting with the breeze. Lazcano stood, a solitary figure against the pale moonlight. Every man in his command, every operative, every scout, every observer, was functioning according to principles he had silently instilled. The day's operations, imperceptible to the outside world, had reinforced discipline, coordination, and respect. In silence, influence had been exercised. In quiet, authority had been established. In invisibility, power had been asserted. The desert, eternal and unforgiving, had witnessed yet another cycle of mastery. Lazcano had demonstrated once more that a leader need not be seen to command, need not shout to enforce, and need not intervene overtly to achieve results. His methods, refined through years of military training, observation, and patient strategy, had proven effective beyond imagination. Los Zetas were no longer just a network. They were a ghostly force, disciplined, coordinated, and psychologically formidable, guided by a leader whose presence was felt in every decision, every movement, and every perception of the men and territories under his influence. As he finally descended from the ridge, moving into the shadowed pathways known only to him, Lazcano left behind a world that had been shaped subtly, quietly, and irrevocably by his will. Orders had been executed without noise, control had been maintained without confrontation, power had been exercised without spectacle. And in that quiet he found satisfaction, knowing that the most enduring influence is the one that operates invisibly, like a shadow across the desert, shaping outcomes and commanding respect without ever being overtly seen. The desert stretched endlessly under a crescent moon, its contours softened by the dim silver light. Shadows pooled and shifted like living things across the dunes and rocky ridges, a silent, undulating landscape where perception was as vital as action. It was in this vast empty world that Heriberto Lazcano had perfected one of his most potent skills, the ability to appear, vanish, and influence without being noticed, an omnipresent specter among men who could never predict where he would manifest next. He moved slowly along the edge of a ridge overlooking a secluded camp, a subtle presence blending seamlessly with the darkness. To the casual observer, he might have been nothing more than a shadow against the sand, a trick of moonlight on stone. Yet to those who operated within the network he had built, even the possibility of his presence was enough to provoke discipline, vigilance, and instinctive obedience. Lazcano had learned that power was as much about perception as it was about action, and his ghostly presence amplified the psychological grip he exerted over his men. Within the camp, men went about routine tasks, checking equipment, distributing supplies, and performing patrols. Each movement was disciplined but relaxed, reflective of the confidence and training Lazcano had instilled. Yet beneath that apparent calm was a tension, a subtle awareness that any action could be observed, assessed, and corrected, not necessarily through punishment, but through the knowledge that he was always somewhere, always watching. Lazcano paused behind a dune, observing a squad of scouts returning from a distant reconnaissance. Their steps were measured, their gestures precise, and yet he noted the slightest hesitations, the faint misalignments in formation. To the untrained eye, such details would be inconsequential. To Lazcano, they were vital indicators of focus, discipline, and morale. His mind processed the information with rapid clarity, cataloging strengths, vulnerabilities, and the subtleties of human behavior in real time. He chose not to reveal himself immediately. There was power in ambiguity, in allowing his presence to remain unknown while ensuring it was felt psychologically. The men would sense it in the rhythm of the camp, in the alignment of their peers, in the faint awareness that oversight was constant. Lazcano had become a ghost, not only in his physical movements, but in the mental landscape of his organization. His influence reached everywhere, unseen, yet undeniably present. At intervals, he would appear briefly, emerging from the shadows like a whisper of wind, and then disappear again. A subtle nod to a squad leader, a fleeting glance toward a patrol line, a soft step behind an operative, all served as reminders that the ghost was watching. These appearances were unpredictable and fleeting, designed not to issue commands, but to reinforce discipline and loyalty through the quiet assertion of presence. Men quickly learned that to act with precision and awareness was the safest path, and that deviation, even minor, could carry consequences both immediate and abstract. The camp's atmosphere reflected Lazcano's invisible influence. Tents were arranged strategically, supply lines reinforced, observation points positioned for maximum coverage. Men moved efficiently, anticipating one another's actions and responding instinctively to subtle cues. Lazcano had trained them to internalize the rules, to act in accordance with principles rather than explicit instructions. The organization had become a living extension of his mind, operating with both autonomy and coherence, guided by a leader who existed simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. He approached a small group discussing reconnaissance reports. Without interrupting, he allowed their words to unfold, listening carefully to the cadence, emphasis, and choice of phrasing. Subtle errors, assumptions, or misinterpretations were noted, catalogued, and later addressed through indirect instruction or reassignment. Lazcano understood that direct confrontation was often less effective than quiet correction, and that influence was most enduring when internalized rather than imposed. A sudden movement caught his attention. A recruit had inadvertently strayed slightly off patrol path, his eyes flicking toward the horizon in a manner suggesting distraction. Lazcano emerged briefly from shadow, a subtle step that the recruit felt more than saw. A quiet acknowledgement, a subtle shift in posture, and the recruit instinctively corrected course. No words had been spoken, no reprimand issued, yet the lesson was received with clarity. In this, Lazcano demonstrated the profound efficacy of ghostly oversight. Influence without direct command, correction without spectacle. Throughout the night, he continued his rounds, moving silently among sleeping tents, observation posts, and patrol lines. Each man, unaware of the exact moment of his presence, nevertheless experienced its psychological impact. Lazcano's mastery lay in understanding that uncertainty enhances discipline. By existing unpredictably, he ensured that attention, focus, and loyalty were maintained consistently, without the need for constant reinforcement. The desert itself seemed to amplify his methods. The shifting sands, the faint sounds of distant wildlife, the subtle movements of wind and shadow, all became part of the training environment, part of the system of observation and control. Lazcano encouraged his men to integrate the natural world into their awareness, to treat the environment as an extension of the network's operational map. This attention to detail and integration of terrain and perception strengthened their ability to act decisively when required, while maintaining the silent discipline that Lazcano demanded. By midnight, the camp was quiet, yet Lazcano's mental map of activity, movements, and potential threats had expanded significantly. Every patrol, every observation, every report had been processed and integrated into a comprehensive understanding of the operational landscape. The ghost among men had orchestrated order, reinforced discipline, and ensured the continuity of influence, all without raising his voice, issuing a single command, or revealing the full extent of his presence. In rare moments of solitude, he reflected on the duality of visibility and power. To be seen was to risk challenge. To be unseen was to command imagination, respect, and caution. Los Zetas, under his leadership, had evolved into a force that existed simultaneously in action and perception, in presence and absence. Every member internalized this principle. The ghost was always near, whether physically apparent or not, and their success depended on understanding and responding to that invisible influence. The dawn approached, painting the desert with muted pastels, casting long moving shadows across dunes and valleys. Lazcano stood on the ridge, observing the interplay of light and shadow, assessing patterns, noting changes. His presence was ephemeral, yet indelible in the minds of those he guided. The ghost among men had succeeded in reinforcing discipline, loyalty, and efficiency, not through confrontation, but through the subtle mastery of perception and silent assertion of authority. In this manner, Heriberto Lazcano moved among his organization like a force of nature, elusive, omnipresent, and profoundly influential. The desert, the night, the men themselves, all became instruments in a quiet symphony of power. And as he finally retreated to the safety of hidden pathways known only to him, the lessons of the night were clear. Authority is strongest when it is imperceptible, obedience most enduring when it is self-regulated, and influence most profound when it is invisible. By sunrise, Los Zetas had been guided through a night of preparation, observation, and silent instruction, all orchestrated without spectacle. Lazcano's ghostly presence had ensured that the organization functioned as a cohesive, disciplined entity, ready to act decisively, unpredictably, and effectively. And in the silence of the desert morning, the lessons of the night would endure, internalized, respected, and woven into the very fabric of the men he commanded. The desert was never silent. Even in the stillness of night, there were subtle signals, tiny fluctuations in the rhythm of life that spoke volumes to those trained to hear. To most, it was nothing but shifting sand, distant animal cries, and the faint hiss of wind across dunes. To Heriberto Lazcano, it was a symphony of intelligence, an ever-changing flow of information that revealed the movements, intentions, and vulnerabilities of men and territories alike. This was the true power of observation, of awareness, and of patience, qualities that had transformed him from a soldier into a ghost among men. He crouched atop a ridge, shadowed by the jagged outline of a canyon, eyes sweeping over the valley below. Fires flickered in scattered settlements, smoke trailing faintly in the dry night air. In these small flickers he could detect anomalies, a light burning where there should be none, movement in the wrong pattern, a patrol slightly off its usual route. Each observation, however minor, was catalogued in his mind, cross-referenced with reports from scouts, and interpreted within the framework of strategy he had meticulously developed over years. The desert itself carried whispers, subtle indications of activity far beyond immediate sight. The rustling of sand, the movement of creatures, even the way smoke rose in still air, these were all cues. Lazcano had trained his men to understand these signals as well, to read the environment as they would read a map or a ledger. The wilderness, in its unpredictability, became an ally, revealing information to those who had the patience to notice. To those who did not, it remained simply a backdrop, empty and silent. Information, Lazcano knew, was only useful if interpreted correctly. Over the years he had developed an intricate network of couriers, informants and trusted observers, all operating under protocols that prioritized subtlety, discretion, and reliability. Messages were rarely written plainly. Instead, they were encrypted, coded, and passed through layers of verification to ensure authenticity. No man received more than he needed to know. No operation was exposed beyond its required scope. This meticulous management of intelligence ensured not only operational efficiency but also the psychological reinforcement of Lazcano's unseen authority. He observed a distant group approaching one of the valley's outposts. The men moved cautiously, aware that they were being watched, yet unaware of the extent of Lazcano's observation. A slight shift in the wind carried the faintest hint of their presence to his scouts, who relayed it through subtle signals. Lazcano noted their formation, their pace, the minor inconsistencies that might reveal intent or weakness. Such details, when accumulated, allowed him to anticipate movements before they became threats, to adjust deployments proactively, and to influence outcomes without ever revealing his direct involvement. Even the most mundane communications were laden with significance. Lazcano had trained his operatives to detect subtle variations in tone, body language, and timing. A messenger arriving late, a hesitant glance, or an unusually emphatic phrase could all signify a breach of protocol, an emerging threat, or an opportunity. Every piece of information was integrated into his mental model of operations, forming a living map of human behavior, environmental cues, and potential outcomes. He was everywhere yet nowhere, omnipresent yet invisible. The desert wind carried more than dust. It carried rumors, stories whispered by travelers, traders, and locals, hints of rival factions, reports of law enforcement movements, and even the faintest echoes of discontent within his own ranks. Lazcano treated each whisper as a data point, assessing reliability, context, and potential implications. Some were ignored, others were tested through observation or subtle probing. The true value lay not in the rumor itself but in its strategic interpretation. What could it reveal, how could it be used, and how did it align with patterns he already recognized? During one such evening, a series of minor anomalies drew his attention. A wagon deviating slightly from its usual route, lights flickering inconsistently in a small settlement, unusual chatter overheard by a distant informant. Each event, minor in isolation, formed a constellation when analyzed collectively. Patterns emerged, signaling potential threats or opportunities. Lazcano adjusted his strategy quietly, repositioning men, reinforcing observation points, and subtly influencing movements, all without a single overt command. This invisible orchestration of events was the hallmark of his leadership. He often reflected on the psychological impact of such methods. Fear, respect, and loyalty were most potent when the source of authority was ambiguous. His men operated with constant awareness, not because of immediate punishment or reward, but because they understood that Lazcano could observe, assess, and influence at any moment. Rival factions, too, were constrained by uncertainty, hesitant to act against a presence they could neither see nor predict. The unseen hand shaped behavior more reliably than any visible threat. As midnight deepened, Lazcano allowed himself a moment to observe his own environment. The stars overhead were cold and constant, indifferent to human activity, yet they mirrored the constancy of his vigilance. Every ridge, every dune, every valley was part of a living map, constantly updated in his mind. The desert was a partner in strategy, a repository of information, and a silent witness to his orchestration of influence. Even the wind, shifting unpredictably, played a role. It could carry the faintest sound, the scent of smoke, or the subtle rustle of movement. Lazcano had trained his men to account for these factors, to anticipate, adapt, and exploit them. The desert was not merely a backdrop, it was an extension of his operational awareness, enhancing both strategic reach and psychological impact. By the early hours of the morning, the valley had been silently surveyed, threats assessed, and movements subtly influenced. Information had flowed through multiple layers of observation, integrated into a comprehensive mental model. Every scout, every informant, every subtle signal had been accounted for. Lazcano's ghostly presence had shaped perception, reinforced discipline, and ensured that the organization remained cohesive, adaptive, and psychologically formidable. In these quiet moments, he contemplated the elegance of his method. Influence need not be loud, authority need not be visible. Power, when exercised through observation, subtlety, and strategic interpretation of information, was enduring and pervasive. He had become a master of the desert's whispers, a strategist whose reach extended far beyond the visible, whose influence shaped behavior without confrontation. As the first light of dawn tinged the horizon with pale pinks and oranges, Lazcano withdrew from the ridge. The desert, with all its subtle signals and hidden patterns, had been surveyed, and the lessons of the night had been integrated into his network's ongoing operations. The whispers of the desert, rumors, observations, and subtle cues, had reinforced his control, allowing Los Zetas to function as a disciplined, invisible, and psychologically potent force. Heriberto Lazcano, the ghost of the desert, had once again demonstrated that knowledge, observation, and subtlety could shape outcomes more effectively than any overt action, and that power is most enduring when it is felt rather than seen. The desert, silent and patient, carried his influence like wind across dunes, and every movement below reflected the quiet orchestration of a leader whose authority was invisible yet absolute. Northern Mexico's nights had a rhythm all their own, a quiet cadence that stretched across the dunes, canyons, and settlements. For Heriberto Lazcano, these nights were both routine and revelatory. They allowed him to consolidate power, assess loyalty, and observe the delicate balance of his empire. Los Zetas had matured into an organization of formidable discipline, efficiency, and precision, but the true test of power lay not in action alone, but in the control maintained during periods of apparent calm. From his vantage point atop a ridge, Lazcano surveyed the network he had meticulously built. Patrols moved silently through valleys, scouts reported movements with subtle signals, and couriers carried encrypted messages across the desert. To the untrained eye, the organization seemed steady and predictable, a system running like clockwork. But Lazcano knew better. Stability was fragile and calm was the prelude to opportunity, or threat. The success of the cartel rested on the ability to remain vigilant, disciplined, and psychologically dominant, even when no immediate crisis demanded action. The night was cool, the desert air carrying the faint scent of mesquite and distant fires. Shadows stretched across the sand, shifting with the wind, creating a landscape that required constant observation. Lazcano moved among his men without detection, a ghostly figure whose presence was more inferred than seen. Even the most alert operatives felt the weight of his unseen gaze, adjusting their movements, their focus, and their decisions to align with the silent expectations of their leader. It was a subtle, pervasive influence that reinforced loyalty and efficiency without the need for overt commands. He considered the operational flow of the day. Supply lines had been secured, patrol rotations optimized, and reconnaissance completed. Every operative, every outpost, and every observation point functioned according to protocols he had meticulously refined. Lazcano's genius was not in dictating every action in real time, but in creating a system capable of autonomous function under his strategic framework. Each member understood their role, anticipated the movements of others, and acted with initiative guided by principles rather than direct orders. Yet Lazcano also understood the fragility of perception. Influence, he knew, depended on subtlety. Too much visibility could invite challenge, too little could foster doubt. He maintained a careful balance, appearing at unpredictable intervals, allowing his presence to be felt without being seen. These appearances were brief, a shadow passing among tents, a nod from a distant ridge, a subtle glance during a meeting, but their psychological impact was profound. Men internalized discipline because they knew the ghost was always watching. In the quiet moments before dawn, Lazcano reflected on the broader landscape. Northern Mexico was a territory of shifting alliances, fragile loyalties, and latent threats. Rival factions operated with unpredictability, local authorities monitored selectively, and internal ambition always lurked beneath the surface. Maintaining control required constant observation, the integration of intelligence, and the strategic application of influence. Lazcano's approach was holistic. He governed not only through orders but through the invisible orchestration of perception and expectation. The desert itself was an instrument of control. Its vastness, its silence, and its subtle changes in wind, light, and terrain provided cues that Lazcano and his men used to maintain situational awareness. He taught his operatives to read these cues as carefully as they read human behavior, to integrate environmental observations into decision-making, and to act decisively when subtle shifts indicated opportunity or threat. In this way, the natural world became an ally, reinforcing the strategic and psychological frameworks Lazcano had established. Over the weeks and months leading to the pivotal year of 2012, Lazcano consolidated his influence further. Men under his command operated with near-perfect discipline, rival factions were neutralized through subtle intimidation and strategic positioning, and settlements came to recognize the quiet, pervasive authority of Los Zetas. Every operation, every patrol, every observation reinforced the culture of unseen mastery that defined his leadership. Lazcano had become a ghost not merely in physical terms, but in the collective consciousness of all who operated in his sphere of influence. In these periods of calm, Lazcano also tested the loyalty and initiative of his men. Small deviations, unexpected scenarios, and controlled uncertainties were introduced deliberately. Operatives were observed responding to these stimuli, and their effectiveness and judgment assessed. This practice ensured that the organization remained adaptive, resilient, and capable of maintaining cohesion even in his absence. The calm was a crucible, refining discipline and strengthening the psychological imprint of his invisible authority. During one particularly quiet night, Lazcano observed a subtle pattern in the movements of rival groups along a distant trade route. The shifts were minor, slightly altered paths, delays in supply convoys, but when interpreted collectively, they revealed an emergent strategy that could pose a future threat. Lazcano adjusted his own network accordingly, reallocating scouts, adjusting patrol rotations, and subtly influencing the terrain through controlled presence. None of these adjustments were overt. They were woven seamlessly into the fabric of ongoing operations. This was the hallmark of his approach: control exercised through subtlety, precision, and anticipation. The psychological impact of these methods was profound. Men within his organization internalized discipline, knowing that every action was observed, every decision assessed, and every movement anticipated. Rival factions acted cautiously, uncertain of where Lazcano might appear or what influence he might exert. The perception of omnipresence, whether real or imagined, reinforced both loyalty and caution. Power had become intangible, yet undeniable, permeating the behavior of those within and around the network. By the time dawn began to tint the horizon with pale orange, Lazcano had completed his nightly observations. The desert lay quiet, shadows stretching and fading with the first light. Yet the operations of the network continued seamlessly. Supply lines remained secure, observation points functioned, and men moved with disciplined autonomy. Lazcano's presence, though invisible, had ensured cohesion, efficiency, and psychological dominance. This period before 2012, the calm before the disappearance, was critical. It demonstrated not only the effectiveness of his leadership but also the depth of his control. Los Zetas functioned as a living organism, adaptive, disciplined, and guided by principles internalized rather than imposed. The organization had reached a state of operational maturity, capable of autonomous action yet fully aligned with the vision and strategy of its ghostly leader. In these quiet hours, Lazcano reflected on the paradox of influence. The most enduring power, he understood, is often exercised not through visible action but through the strategic management of perception, expectation, and anticipation. His men, his rivals, and even the land itself had become instruments in a system of silent, pervasive authority. And in the desert, amid its endless dunes and shifting shadows, he had perfected this art, the art of influence without display, control without spectacle, and power without overt confrontation. As the morning sun fully rose, casting long shadows across the rugged terrain, Lazcano withdrew from observation. The world remained unaware of the full scope of his influence. Operations had been executed flawlessly, men had acted with discipline, and rival factions remained constrained by uncertainty. The calm had reinforced power, and the whispers of authority continued to echo in the minds of all who inhabited his sphere. In this delicate equilibrium, the legend of Lazcano grew, not through action alone, but through the perception of omnipresence, the anticipation of influence, and the silent orchestration of events. The calm before the storm, the quiet before his eventual disappearance, was both a demonstration and a rehearsal of the mastery he had cultivated over years. A leader who moved invisibly, commanded respect silently, and prepared to vanish without leaving a trace. Northern Mexico had long been a land of whispered power, shifting sands, and shadowed mountains. By 2012, Heriberto Lazcano had reached a pinnacle few could comprehend. Los Zetas operated with the precision of a well-oiled machine, disciplined, coordinated, and psychologically formidable. His presence, though often unseen, was felt in every movement of men, every decision in settlements, every subtle shift in the behavior of rivals. He had mastered the art of influence through silence, and yet even masters of presence must occasionally embrace absence. The night before his disappearance was unremarkable to those who observed from afar. Winds whispered across dunes, faint fires glimmered in scattered settlements, and the stars traced their eternal paths across the velvet sky. Within his inner circle, operations proceeded as usual. Scouts reported movements, couriers relayed messages, patrols moved with meticulous precision. To anyone watching, the system functioned flawlessly. Yet Lazcano understood that true mastery of control often lies in moments when expectation is suspended, when the familiar rhythm of presence is replaced by the subtle tension of absence. From a hidden ridge, he observed his network one final time before he would withdraw from the world in a manner few could anticipate. The men who had become extensions of his own mind executed their tasks with autonomy, their discipline reinforced through years of training, observation, and psychological influence. Every detail of the landscape, every nuance of movement, every whispered rumor had been catalogued. And now, the final step of his meticulous orchestration was imminent, the vanishing. He moved silently through familiar terrain, using routes known only to himself, paths that blurred with shadow and sand. No firelight betrayed his position, no sound marked his passage. The desert, his lifelong partner in observation and strategy, absorbed his presence and concealed it from others. Scouts along the ridge would note no anomalies, rivals would see no disturbance, and even his closest operatives would remain unaware until after his departure. This was the culmination of years of mastery, to command influence even in absence, to exist in perception without corporeal presence. Within the settlements below, life continued as expected. Operations of Los Zetas proceeded without disruption. Patrols remained disciplined. Observers noted nothing amiss. Yet subtle shifts began to ripple through the network. A messenger arrived at a camp earlier than usual, a scout paused slightly longer at a ridge, and men instinctively adjusted their actions. Though they could not perceive why, an unspoken awareness began to settle, a recognition that the ghost had moved beyond their reach. Lazcano's influence persisted, yet his physical presence receded into legend. He paused at a familiar canyon, reflecting on the precision of his departure. Unlike chaotic disappearances seen in history, this would be silent, deliberate, and carefully orchestrated. Every operative, every scout, every observer had been conditioned to maintain functionality without immediate oversight. The organization's autonomy ensured that his absence would not disrupt operations, yet the psychological impact of his vanishing would resonate far beyond the immediate hours. The desert had taught him patience, and patience was now his final tool in vanishing, leaving behind influence, not presence, authority, not evidence. Rival factions, unaware of his exact movements, began to sense subtle changes in the environment. Patrols altered slightly, trade routes shifted with caution, and whispers of uncertainty circulated among men who thought themselves safe. These ripples, imperceptible to most, were exactly the intended effect. Lazcano had learned that power is magnified when absence replaces expectation, when uncertainty reinforces obedience, and when the mind perceives omnipresence without visible enforcement. In the hours before dawn, he traversed the last segments of familiar terrain. The moon, low and cold, cast long shadows across ridges and valleys, masking movement and blending form with earth and stone. Every step, every pause, every breath had been rehearsed mentally for years. There would be no trace. No single act would betray the orchestrator. And yet, his influence remained woven into the patterns of men, the behavior of settlements, and the perception of rivals. Lazcano had achieved the rare mastery of invisible command. By the time the first light tinged the horizon, casting pale oranges and muted pinks across dunes, Lazcano was already beyond the perception of those who had once counted on him. He had vanished without fanfare, without confrontation, without spectacle. The desert had swallowed him, leaving no physical clue of his movements, only the enduring impact of his absence. Scouts would later report his absence as though it were a natural void, subtle and complete. Men in his network continued operations, disciplined as always, guided by principles internalized through years of observation, training, and silent reinforcement. Even in his absence, the organization remained cohesive, adaptive, and psychologically potent. Rival factions would speculate, authorities would search, and operatives would wonder, yet the ghost was everywhere and nowhere, a concept rather than a presence, a force rather than a figure. Lazcano had transformed disappearance into a strategy, absence into influence, and retreat into legacy. The desert carried his legacy silently. Winds shifted over dunes, carrying with them the faint impressions of a presence that could not be seen but could be felt. The valleys, ridges, and settlements he had traversed remained intact in pattern and order, testament to the precision of his methods. Influence without visibility, control without overt action, and authority without confrontation. These were the hallmarks of Lazca's final performance before vanishing. By noon, the world had begun to realize the magnitude of what had occurred. Men noted minor deviations, patterns slightly altered, and the absence of their leader's presence. Yet the organization continued seamlessly, as if guided by some unseen hand. The effectiveness of his departure lay not merely in physical invisibility, but in the psychological reinforcement of his ghostly authority, a presence maintained entirely through perception, discipline, and expectation. In the quiet hours that followed, Lazcano's legend began to form. Those within Los Zetas understood instinctively that their leader had left, yet the imprint of his authority persisted. Rival factions felt hesitation and uncertainty, sensing influence without encountering form. The world outside the organization would later puzzle over the disappearance, yet the truth was simple. Lazcano had executed one final operation, one that extended beyond action into the realm of perception, leaving only questions and a pervasive, intangible influence. By evening, the desert seemed unchanged, yet the impact of his vanishing resonated. Scouts, operatives, and distant observers unconsciously adjusted behavior, guided by expectation and subtle cues embedded over years of training. Lazcano had transformed disappearance into a force of nature, an extension of his method. Influence through absence, authority through subtlety, and legacy through perception alone. The desert held his presence in memory, in rhythm, in shadows and whispers that would endure long after footsteps had disappeared. Heriberto Lazcano had achieved the rare mastery of a ghost, to command, to influence, and to shape outcomes without being present, and to leave behind an organization that functioned flawlessly in his absence. The legend of El Lazca was no longer defined by action, confrontation, or visibility, it was defined by the enduring power of absence, the omnipresent shadow of a man who had learned to move through the world without leaving trace, yet leaving influence in every grain of sand, every shadow, and every mind attuned to his silent authority. The desert had settled into a quiet rhythm following the vanishing of Heriberto Lazcano. Northern Mexico stretched under a sky streaked with stars, the wind whispering softly over dunes and canyons, carrying dust and faint echoes of movement. Yet even in his absence the presence of El Lazca lingered, pervasive, intangible, and profoundly influential. The ghost had not left merely because his body had vanished. He remained as a guiding force, shaping behavior, decisions, and outcomes across the territories he once oversaw. Within Los Zetas, operations continued seamlessly. Men moved with the discipline instilled over years of observation, training, and subtle reinforcement. Patrols executed routes with precision, scouts reported anomalies with accuracy, and couriers delivered messages without hesitation. The absence of their leader did not create chaos. Rather, it highlighted the effectiveness of internalized principles and the invisible architecture of command Lazcano had established. The organization operated autonomously, yet every action reflected the imprint of his strategic design. Across settlements and outposts, subtle shifts occurred. Those familiar with his methods noticed an almost imperceptible tension, the reminder of authority, now present only in its psychological manifestation. Scouts adjusted movements, patrols held to stricter timing, and minor lapses in discipline were self-corrected. These changes were not enforced by command, they were guided by expectation, memory, and the perception of omnipresence. Lazcano's influence persisted without corporeal form, a ghost commanding through legacy and perception alone. Even rival factions, unaware of his exact whereabouts, felt the weight of his absence. Uncertainty is a powerful tool, and Lazcano's disappearance amplified it. Rivals moved cautiously, hesitant to act in ways that might trigger consequences from an unseen hand. Rumors of his methods, his reach, and his discipline spread like wildfire, reinforcing his psychological authority. Where he once directed with subtle gestures, he now commanded through the enduring perception of inevitability and omniscience. The ghostly influence extended beyond the immediate organization. Communities, settlements, and peripheral operators adjusted behavior in response to the unseen leader. Trades were conducted with caution, alliances weighed carefully, and actions measured against the invisible standard he had established. Lazcano had long understood that power is as much about shaping perception as it is about executing strategy, and in absence, this principle became his ultimate demonstration. Within the inner circle of Los Zetas, men continued to act as extensions of his mind. Subtle signals, codes, gestures, routines, remained operational, guiding actions without interruption. Leadership had been decentralized, but the organizational culture ensured cohesion. Discipline was maintained through internalized standards, peer reinforcement, and the psychological imprint of their ghostly leader. Decisions, even in his absence, reflected the philosophy Lazcano had instilled: patience, observation, precision, and strategic anticipation. The desert itself seemed to carry his presence. Winds shifted with subtle imperceptibility, sands moved under the moonlight, and the landscape whispered secrets to those attuned. Scouts trained under Lazcano could detect anomalies, anticipate threats, and adapt operations with instinctual precision. The natural environment had been integrated into the system of influence, extending his reach far beyond physical limitations. Even unseen, the ghost shaped outcomes through terrain, observation, and perception. In quiet moments, his former lieutenants reflected on his teachings. Lazcano had emphasized autonomy, foresight, and internalized discipline. He had trained men to act decisively within a framework of principles, anticipating contingencies without direct oversight. Now, in absence, these lessons were tested and proven. The organization functioned not because of fear alone, nor because of immediate command, but because the expectation of oversight, the memory of discipline, and the legend of his presence guided behavior seamlessly. Across the northern territories, stories began to circulate. Some spoke of El Lazca as a man, others as a ghost. Tales of his vigilance, strategic brilliance, and ability to vanish without trace became folklore among operatives, rivals, and civilians alike. His legend was perpetuated not through spectacle or public display, but through the enduring perception of his authority. Presence, even in absence, commanded obedience. Invisibility reinforced control. The psychological architecture of his influence was perhaps the most profound legacy. Men who had once relied on direct supervision now internalized standards, corrected mistakes autonomously, and anticipated requirements with uncanny accuracy. Loyalty was maintained not through fear of punishment, but through awareness of potential consequences and recognition of the principles Lazcano had ingrained. The Ghost had become a system, a network of expectation, discipline, and strategic influence that operated independently of physical presence. Rival factions remained cautious, constrained by uncertainty. They could not predict where or even if Lazcano might intervene. This uncertainty magnified his influence, allowing the organization to operate with minimal overt enforcement while maintaining dominance. Even minor operational errors were corrected proactively by members internalizing his philosophy. Through absence, he had multiplied his effectiveness, shaping outcomes in ways that physical presence alone could never achieve. His influence extended into the economy and social fabric of the region. Traders, merchants, and local leaders adjusted routines in anticipation of cartel oversight. Routes were modified, behaviors measured, and allegiances subtly realigned. Lazcano's power had become a pervasive, invisible force, a ghostly infrastructure of influence that permeated the desert, settlements, and minds of those who inhabited them. In the solitude of his hidden location, Lazcano reflected on the success of his approach. He had transformed from a soldier executing orders to a strategist who commanded through observation, subtlety, and psychological mastery. His vanishing had not diminished power, it had amplified it, demonstrating the enduring potential of influence exercised invisibly. The desert, silent witness to his life and methods, seemed to validate the precision, patience, and subtlety that had defined his leadership. The ghost of Heriberto Lazcano existed now not merely as a legend, but as a living system of influence. His methods ensured the continuity, discipline, and psychological dominance of Los Zetas. Men acted with foresight, loyalty endured without constant supervision, and rivals hesitated in uncertainty. In this quiet mastery, Lazcano demonstrated a principle he had refined over decades. True power lies in the invisible hand, in the perception of control, and in the enduring psychological imprint of presence, whether corporeal or absent. By nightfall, the desert had returned to its muted rhythm. Winds whispered over dunes, stars shimmered in the vast sky, and shadows pooled in familiar patterns. Yet the ghost of Lazcano remained everywhere, an invisible architect shaping decisions, movements, and outcomes. Influence had outlasted presence, and authority had transcended visibility. Even in absence, the legend of Lazca persisted, a testament to a lifetime of silent command, meticulous strategy, and the enduring power of the ghost among men. The desert at twilight seemed eternal, stretching endlessly under a sky brushed with muted purples and soft amber. The wind whispered over the dunes, carrying sand, dust, and echoes of lives unseen. Heriberto Lazcano's name had become legend, not for spectacle, not for noise, but for the subtle mastery of influence, discipline, and silence. Even years after his disappearance, the shadow of Lazca lingered, intangible yet undeniable, shaping the rhythm of life in northern Mexico as surely as the sun guided the dunes. His former operatives moved through the desert with instinctive precision, their actions guided by principles internalized under his mentorship. Patrols traced familiar routes, scouts scanned the horizon with practiced eyes, and couriers delivered coded messages seamlessly. Every step, every observation, every decision reflected the ghostly architecture he had left behind. Los Zetas functioned not only as a network of men but as a living embodiment of Lazcano's strategic mind. In his absence, they were disciplined, coordinated, and psychologically attuned to an invisible presence that ensured cohesion. The whisper of his influence extended far beyond immediate operations. Settlements, merchants, and peripheral factions adjusted behavior unconsciously, aware of the ghostly authority that might be observing, might be judging, might intervene in subtle ways. The uncertainty of his absence created a pervasive restraint. Actions were calculated, movements deliberate, and alliances carefully considered. Lazcano had transformed disappearance into a psychological instrument, magnifying the reach of authority beyond the limits of physical presence. In quiet moments, former lieutenants and trusted operatives would reflect on the lessons he had imparted. Leadership was more than giving orders, it was cultivating perception. Discipline was maintained not through constant oversight but through the internalized anticipation of what the ghost would expect. Knowledge was power, yes, but even more so, the anticipation of unseen authority guided choices, shaped behavior, and enforced cohesion. Lazcano's approach transcended conventional methods. He had become a master of influence, his authority encoded into the very habits and decisions of those around him. Across the desert, the land itself seemed to carry echoes of his presence. Dunes shifted, shadows pooled and stretched, and the wind carried whispers that might once have been directives, or perhaps memories, or perhaps nothing at all. To those attuned, the desert's subtle messages were unmistakable. Vigilance, attention to detail, respect for unseen authority. The environment had become a medium through which Lazcano's influence persisted. Even in the absence of physical form, he orchestrated outcomes, reinforced loyalty, and preserved discipline. Rival factions continued to feel the effect of his presence, or rather, the perception of it. They moved cautiously, hesitated to act, and interpreted even minor disturbances as potential interventions. In this way, the ghost of Lazcano exerted power without confrontation, shaping not only his own network but the behavior of adversaries. Influence became intangible yet profoundly effective. Fear, respect, and compliance were cultivated silently, through expectation, observation, and the lingering awareness that the unseen hand could touch any moment. The network he had built operated autonomously, yet remained coherent. Decisions were made in accordance with principles he had instilled: patience, precision, anticipation, and discretion. Every operative had internalized the philosophy that had guided their leader for decades. Obedience was reinforced not through shouting or punishment, but through recognition that success and survival depended on alignment with the ghostly standards Lazcano had created. In his absence, the culture endured, strengthened by the continuity of his principles. Even the mundane routines, the movement of supplies, the timing of patrols, the communication of intelligence, were imbued with purpose. Men acted as extensions of his strategic vision, anticipating threats, mitigating risks, and ensuring cohesion across the organization. The desert, once a passive backdrop, had become a partner, a silent witness, and a medium through which the ghost exerted enduring influence. Every dune, every ridge, every subtle shift in light or shadow was accounted for, a component of a system as invisible as it was effective. As night deepened, stars scattered across the sky, cold and distant, yet steady and constant. Lazcano's presence, or rather, the perception of his presence, was interwoven with the rhythm of the land and the behavior of the people within it. Every scout, operative, and peripheral observer carried the imprint of his influence. Decisions were guided by anticipation, actions reinforced by training, and loyalty maintained through the pervasive awareness of omnipresent authority. In essence, the ghost had become more than legend. He had become a system. For those who had served under him, the desert was no longer empty. Every rustle of wind, every shadow in the moonlight, every faint glimmer in the distance could carry meaning. Training, observation, and anticipation had transformed perception into power. The influence of Lazcano was embedded into habits, decisions, and behaviors. Men moved as he had taught, acted as he had instructed, and thought as he had modeled. The ghost existed not in body but in mind, in environment, and in the silent, enduring principles that had shaped his empire. Stories began to circulate, whispered along trade routes and in remote settlements. Some recounted the precision and discipline of Los Zetas, others spoke of sudden shifts in behavior among rival groups, and some simply referred to the ghostly legend that guided outcomes from beyond observation. These tales, even when exaggerated, reinforced the psychological influence Lazcano had cultivated. The absence of spectacle magnified the perception of power. Legend became strategy and strategy became legend. By dawn, the desert returned to its muted, patient rhythm. Shadows receded, dunes glistened under the pale light, and the wind continued its eternal whisper. The network operated flawlessly, scouts and operatives executing duties as if guided by an unseen hand. Rival factions hesitated, settlements remained disciplined, and the influence of the ghost permeated the land. The desert, silent and eternal, carried the echoes of Lazca, a presence felt more than seen, guiding outcomes through anticipation, perception, and the enduring impact of absence. In these final moments, it was clear that Heriberto Lazcano's story had transcended corporeal boundaries. He was no longer defined by actions observed, battles fought, or orders given. He had become a principle, a system of influence, and a ghost whose reach extended far beyond physical form. The desert, his lifelong partner, bore witness to the subtle orchestration of power. Even in absence he was present, even in silence he commanded, and even in legend his influence endured. The wind shifted across the dunes, carrying dust and faint sounds of life. Shadows pooled and receded as they had for millennia. And in that quiet, infinite rhythm, the ghost of northern Mexico continued to move unseen, his influence embedded in the land, in the people, and in the stories whispered across valleys and ridges. The desert, vast and patient, held his presence as surely as it held its own sands. And for those attuned to listen closely, the echoes of El Lazca lingered, a reminder that the most enduring power is exercised quietly, invisibly, and with patience. A presence felt long after the footsteps that created it have disappeared into shadow.